Hey bio team. So you guys have learned that cell membranes are made up of a molecule called phospholipid. And phospholipids get their name because they have a head that is negatively charged, an ionic head made of a phosphate group. And then they have fatty acid tails. Now the reason that phospholipids are so useful as membranes it has to do with the fact that our cells exist in an aqueous environment, which just means that there is polar water molecules outside of our cells and polar water molecules inside of our cells. So if you were to take phospholipids and expose them to this aqueous environment, what you'd see is that the ionic charged phosphate heads would attract to the polar water molecules and form a barrier on two sides, both on the outside of the cell and the inside of the cell. While the nonpolar fatty acid tails, meanwhile, attract to each other and hold the membrane together. And so we call this double layer of phospholipids, we call it the lipid bilayer, which just gets its name from the two layers that are formed. And so the lipid bilayer is really good at blocking certain types of molecules. It can block ionic molecules or charged particles. So for instance, sodium and chlorine ions up here, salt ions, will not be able to get through the lipid bilayer. The sodium, because it would attract to the negatively charged phosphate heads, and the chlorine, because it would repel. And then the lipid bilayer is also good at blocking really large molecules. They just simply can't fit through. That said, the lipid bilayer is able to allow through certain types of molecules as well. It can allow through small molecules like water and gases like oxygen and carbon dioxide. But it can also allow through some larger nonpolar molecules. So an example of this would be lipid steroids, which are able to pass through the membrane because they have mostly nonpolar bonds. They have mostly carbons and hydrogens in them, which aren't attracted to this wall of phosphate heads. And so we can kind of watch this steroid slip through the membrane there. But this begs the question then, how does our cell get the charged particles that it does need? For instance, if our cells need sodium ions or chlorine ions, how would they get them through their cell membrane? And so our cells actually develop proteins called transport proteins that allow passage of ionic particles. And these can take the form of protein gates, pumps, channels, etc. And so we'll watch this chloride ion go through the transport protein here. And for this reason, biologists describe the cell membrane as a fluid mosaic model. That is, the membrane is a mosaic of different movable parts that are embedded in the lipid bilayer. So there's the phospholipid bilayer, there's the transport proteins, and then you'll actually see these kind of tail-looking things extending off of the bilayer. Those are glycoproteins and glycolipids, which serve as sensors and receptors that can send and receive signals to other cells. And that's it. At this point, you guys have some practice problems. We'll see you next class.